I'm Harold Bailey from Team Westport.
And I'm Alison Patton, pastor of Saugatuck Congregational Church, United Church of Christ in Westport.
And I'm Jenny Nelson. I am the Director of Education and Community Engagement at Westport Country Playhouse. Welcome back. This was your first week of the 28-day challenge. How you doing? We hope you're doing well. You've shown up, which is half of the work, right? Really to just show up for this work, to keep going, to lean in. That's really what's going to sustain you in this work, and to remember your purpose, right? We had talked about that in our last video. Why are you doing this work, right? And to continue to evaluate that. It might change as you go through the journey, and that's okay. This is an evolving process as we are evolving through this process. And I just want to, Layla Saad has given us so many great resources in this book. We just wanted to remind you on page 24 through 26, self-care, support, and sustainability. She really walks us through all the ways that things might come up for you and how to support yourself, how to take care of yourself in this work. And one of the things that really resonated for me was feel your feelings. Right? It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling, if it's shame, if it's pride, if it's anger, exhilaration, whatever it is, feel those feelings, because that's where the work is. This is self-work. And so by feeling your feelings, you're really honoring the work. And I know sometimes these feelings can be uncomfortable and we want to push away from them. But by doing that, we're not honoring the places where you may end up, right? Where you may go in this work to feel those feelings. So that's something that really sustains me in this work. And I hope that helps you too. And one of the other things, in this 7 days, Alison and Harold and I were talking about the book and all the different perspectives that she goes through. For me, white exceptionalism really came up for me the first time I engaged in this book, and I'd love to just read a little passage from white exceptionalism that I immediately highlighted. I don't know about you, but mine is tattered and highlighted, and there's sticky notes and writing all over it. One of the things she says is, if you believe you are exceptional, you will not do the work. If you do not do the work, you will continue to do harm, even if that is not your intention. You are not an exceptional white person, meaning you are not exempt from the conditioning of white supremacy, from the benefits of white privilege, and from the responsibility to keep doing this work for the rest of your life. The moment you begin to think you are exceptional is the moment you begin to relax back into the warm and familiar comfort of white supremacy. I have to say, when I read that for the first time, I sat with that for days. I sat with that for quite a while. And it was really a reckoning that this work never ends, that no matter where we're coming to in this work, whether it's at the beginning, or if we feel like we have some foundational knowledge, or we've really done some sustainable work in our community, the work is never done, right? The work, as Harold said when we were talking, the work isn't done until you're done, until it's all done, right? That we have to keep going and exploring this and not put it down. So that's a little something that came up for me the first time that I was doing this book. And as I'm doing it again, new things are coming up. So wanted to share that with you to give support to the journey. Allison, I think we got some questions this week, which is really exciting. I'd love to pass it over to you and hear what we've got.
We do. I also, as I was listening to you, Jenny, I was reminded that Layla Saad does talk about finding some companions for the journey and being thoughtful about those companions, right? So that if you are a white person, you are not unburdening on your friends of color, but all this work is about rediscovering our humanity, right? She talks about that on page 25 and 26. And so feeling the feelings and then sharing the feelings with somebody who maybe is in the work with you. I don't know, Jenny, did you do that at all when you were going through the journal?
You know, I did. I'm again very fortunate. A friend of mine, another white friend of mine, we did this book together for the first time. And so, you know, we were aligned in that way and we were kind of partners in this. And so just so fortunate to have that person, that other white person to continue this conversation and say, what came up for you and what were you thinking about? And I think so important too, Alison, someone you can be truly honest with. Right? Really authentically honest. We can be honest with ourselves, which Layla Saad really talks about, you know, but it's someone that you can really, whether that's your partner or a best friend, a religious leader, you know, whoever it is, that you can really be honest with them, because otherwise, right, what is the support in the partnership, right?
Right, because this isn't about just sort of unloading the anxiety. This is about being with somebody who helps us to be truth tellers about the work that we need to do, right?
Yes, well said.
Which I so appreciate. And Layla Saad, when she spoke last week, talked about the fact that we are all in it, right? We all breathe the air, but we are also more than the racism that we inherit. And those people that we trust know that, right? So we can hold each other accountable and empower each other, I think, to keep doing that work. That's the only way I can keep going when I think about it as a lifelong journey, right? Is to know that I'm not in this on my own.
Yeah, and don't you feel too that when you do the work, you collect more people
Oh yeah,
that are aligned with the work, right? They gravitate to you because you're putting that energy out that I'm in this work, I'm committed, and I want to be held accountable. And then I just feel like those people show up for you in your life that can help support you.
Harold, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I just remind folks
pitfalls
that while we have not yet put together groups of people who can do this sharing, our intent at the end of this is to have some vehicles available for people that will facilitate those kind of groupings, small groups of people who can really discuss what it was like to go through this and potentially other issues in an ongoing fashion. So there's help on the way.
Yeah. Well, and we hope this is one of those spaces too, where we can support you across the distance and hear back from you about what this experience has been like. So one of the questions that was surfaced this week and that Harold and Jenny and I have been talking about was a question concerning the definition of people of color. Layla Saad uses an acronym, which is a newer acronym in circulation for those of us who are doing anti-racism work. The acronym is BIPOC, B-I-P-O-C, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color. And the question surfaced, what does people of color mean? Black, we can say, may well be folks who are of African descent, Indigenous. We might be able to define more clearly, but then what are those other people of color? So that's the acronym. It's probably a helpful starting place just to let you know what the acronym stands for. But as we were talking about the question, Harold reminded us that there are some historical reasons why we are choosing that acronym as opposed to the more generic people of color or more specific African American, some of the other terms that we've used in recent years as we've talked about this work. So Harold, you want to help us unpack that, what BIPOC is all about?
Sure. I'm great at unpacking things. So let's take a look at this. And so, as Alison mentioned, there have been all kinds of terminologies around this in the past. You know, in the United States, if you go back 50, 60 years, there's terminology like colored, which covered people of color. That could be Black, could be something else. There was Negro for Black as an example. Then we moved into, quote, minority, which is still in vogue right now, I think by most of the country. BIPOC gets us closer to what the real dynamic is that's going on here. So what are we talking about with Black? It's BIPOC. It's Black, Indigenous, and then all other people of color. why is it Black and Indigenous, and why isn't there an A in there for Asian American, and why isn't maybe there an L there for Latinx people? Well, part of it is kind of this whole issue of caste, which is who's on the bottom. And if you talk about the United States specifically, in our history, our 400-year history, there has always been slavery for the last 400 years in this country. Oh, there was a history of slavery for 250 of those 400 years. And in fact, even up to the point where we had a constitution that was put together, culturally in our DNA, Black people were considered less than human, or less human than other people, certainly than white people. Once we got to the Constitution itself, that was actually codified in the Constitution. So you could say the DNA of our country was that a Black person is 3/5 of a human compared to a white person. So there's that. So culturally, constitutionally, until at least the end of the Civil War, Black people were historically considered on the and less human than others. The other thing that went on in this country, though, was basically the ongoing genocide that happened against the Indigenous people in this country. So if we take a look at the Indigenous folks as a category, that's as egregious as what was going on in some ways is what happened to Black people. So it's Black people and Indigenous people because of that history in this country. And then all the others, all other people of color. If you're looking you want to be academic about it, the people that are easy to fit into these categories are the people that are considered biologically African American, people that are considered Indigenous people, so Native Americans is an example in this country. And then the POC would be people who are Asian American, Latin American, Latinx, it's called now. The thing to keep in mind, and the way we've designated things in our country, which is different from other countries, which is Latinx has two categories. There's a category called Latinx white and Latinx non-white. And that goes for our census as well in this country. So those categories where people have self-identified as being in those particular categories of people are people who kind of by definition are BIPOC. But there's really the whole issue here is perception. And that's where I think, Alison, you might have some other things to say about that.
Yeah, so that acronym is really, is Harold, you really highlight, is intended to surface some of the subtle or really not so subtle differences in how various communities of color have been treated in this country, historically speaking, right? And the very fact that different communities have been labeled according to their color is part of the legacy of racism that we inherit. As we wrestled with this question together, what we surfaced is that really, this is, as Layla Saad reminds us, not a question of whether a person was born a person of color or not. This is a question about white power and who has it and who doesn't. And so it's about how we as white people perceive the people and the communities around us. And if we white folks perceive someone as a person of color, then we will afford or deny power accordingly. We do it consciously, we do it subconsciously, unconsciously. That's precisely the challenge that we are being called to grapple with during these 28 days, right? So it's perceptual. Whether you are a person of color is determined by what Layla Saad and others refer to as the white gaze, how you are regarded. You may yourself self-identify as either white or a person of color in terms of your heritage and your culture. But when you show up in a room, whether you are treated as a person of color or as a white person is determined by the white culture and community. Now, Layla Saad does lift up that there is a category of folks, some who are have the ability to find themselves moving in both settings. Those are people who pass as white. Those of you who may be very fair-skinned, who may come from a Latinx or African American or other background, but who might be perceived as white, which means you may have the opportunity to choose to move through the culture with the power and the privilege of a white person. Or you may find that in some settings you can pass and make that choice, and in other settings, whether you want to or not, you get called out and treated as a person of color. And so Layla Saad has a particular kind of invitation for those of you who might be working through this book, who find yourselves at that intersection, who find that you have some power that you are able to wield, and that there are also occasions when you suffer the vagaries of racism. Harold, I wanted to say a little bit more about what this journey might be like for folks in that category.
Well, as someone who would have a very difficult time passing, yeah, let's, one of the primary examples of this is, are the two sons of Thomas Jefferson, who have via DNA been clearly named his sons, who are children of Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved Black woman. One of them lived their life as an African American, as a Black person. The other lived their life as a white person. And so they had the Jefferson name, left, went out and lived that way. This is a really tricky area for in terms of going through this kind of an analysis, because the responses are not just going to be, how have you treated people of another race when you've passed? But it's, how have you treated people of your own race? And how have you, what are your perceptions about people in your own race, your own hangups? So there's a lot of depth there to go into that can be very revealing and very fascinating, as a matter of fact, which will depend upon your personal makeup and the way you operate.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are people who clearly could have passed their entire lives as white, who have just made it very clear from the beginning they're African American. And those people, in many cases, will walk into a room full of Black people, and people start to look around and wonder, what the hell are you doing here? We're talking about certain issues and you don't really have no place here. And they will have to clearly state, hey, I'm Black. Now, that's assuming you're not a Rachel Dolezal and and you weren't. And that's where it gets a little funny there. She was head of the NAACP out in the state of Washington, who stated that she was Black, but so that's some of the complexity here of what's going on.
Yeah. So a little bit of real talk for the white folks in the room, in our virtual space. If your initial response to my suggesting that people of color are really defined by those of us who look at them, if your response is initially, but I don't do that, and I don't treat somebody differently because of how I perceive them, and I'm not denying power from anybody, then buckle your seatbelts, because this next week is a chance for us to dig into the difference between how we hope to be in the world and how we actually do end up exercising our white privilege, whether we realize it or not. Layla Saad invites us in this coming week to parse some of the differences in our assumptions, conscious and unconscious, concerning these different categories of folks of color. And so there are chapters specifically on how we relate to and make assumptions about Black men, Black women, Black children, the Indigenous community, those who are citizens of the United States versus those who are refugees. And you will find that some of the same questions are repeated in each chapter, but as they relate to each of these different categories of our fellow humans. So this will be an opportunity for us to dig a little deeper and reflect a little bit more on the assumptions that we've inherited and how they operate when we relate with communities of color. So that's what you can expect from these next 7 days. Jenny and Harold, would you add anything to that?
I would just say keep the focus on there's an intrinsic piece to the whiteness, and that's what we haven't talked about here. Because BIPOC talks about people who are not white, who are not perceived as white. So it's if you're perceived as BIPOC versus not being perceived as BIPOC. And if you're not perceived as BIPOC, you're being perceived as white, and there's an intrinsic power that you bring into the room in all regards of what's going on. Because we're going to get people who'll say, for instance, hey, what if somebody is in prison? They don't have white privilege while they're in prison. And the answer is, yes, they do. What happens the minute they walk out of prison and they just go outside? Oh, well, and because it's all based on your perception when you see that person without knowing anything about them at all. What are the assumptions that you make about them when they walk into the room? And that's the difference here. That's what we're talking about versus somebody who's of color who might have been right beside them in prison who walks in. You're going to have, it could be, by the way, somebody who's the head of General Motors who happens to be of color who walks into the room, who are not going to have that same set of assumptions that are out there. So that's what we're talking about. The other thing is from an international basis, this whole issue about BIPOC, in talking to Layla, one of the points she made to us, and I should say Layla Saad to be respectful, one of the points that she made to us was that this is not just a US issue. This is a global issue. Certainly, when we talk about parts of the world that have been colonized by, quote, Western civilization, where being Black means, from almost a caste point of view, you're on the bottom. And next up would be the folks who are intrinsically indigenous for whatever part of the country you're in. So the BIPOC terminology works outside the United States to a great extent, the same way it does in the United States.
Yeah. So are you all ready for week 2? As Jenny said at the beginning, you are being brave just for showing up and doing the work. And to the extent that we together are able to fine tune our internal sensors to recognize some of those otherwise unconscious assumptions, to the extent that we can begin to do that, we are doing good work. Because those of us who are here, I think it's safe to assume, Jenny and Harold, that those who are participating in this work care deeply about dismantling racism, and hope that they've been making progress on that front. So we have some filters that we have to get past, because we see ourselves as already doing the good work. Jenny lifted this up to some extent at the beginning, right, with that chapter about white exceptionalism. So consider this next week an invitation to start to notice the filters that we might have, which prevent us from recognizing how those unconscious biases are operating in our lives. And it may take some sitting and digging, right? In some cases, when I first encountered a question, I'd say, well, no, I don't do that. Right? And then I'd have to kind of hang out with the question a little bit longer and say, well,
Yeah.
let me
Yeah.
hang with this a little bit. Yeah, right. So
Yeah.
that's part of the journey,
Mhm.
and we're doing it together.
Yeah.
Jenny?
Yeah. And with a sense of humility and grace, we can do this work, right? We can honor it in that way. And I love that Alison filters. I'm gonna really put that in my mind for this week to really look at those unconscious or conscious filters that we have, and look at our perception, and try to be a good ancestor, as Layla Saad
Love that.
has asked us to be.
Right.
And so if you need support, that is what this group is here for. So please, we loved getting questions. Please continue to send questions about this book, about your journey, things you need support, ways for self-care, to education@westportplayhouse.org. Again, that's education@westportplayhouse.org. And we will assemble those over the week and try to answer them in these videos, so that we're really connecting with you on your journey, because this work is your own work, but it works best when we all work together. So
it's not too late to join in. We know each of us has heard people during the week express interest. So you can find the link to register I think on the Playhouse website, right, Jenny?
mm-hmm.
And on the Saugatuck Church website. And there's details too, we think on the Team Westport has got it.
Team Westport's Facebook page, we've got it.
There you go. So there's 3 places where you can look to find more detail and to invite others to join in as well.
So
Yep.
keep going, keep doing the work. We'll be right there with you, and we'll see you again next week
Next
to continue
Monday.
on the journey.
Yeah, don't forget education@westportplayhouse.org.
For all your questions.
Yes, send us your questions. All right, y'all, have a great week.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Here.
Thanks.